Blog Talk Radio.
Thanks for joining us today on today's interview for Innovation in Myeloma. After doing 2 successful interviews where over 1,500 of you listened in, we're thrilled at the level of interest we're seeing. We hope we can uncover new ideas together, and we welcome your suggestions about additional topics you may want to have covered. You can always email me by going to the MPatient website and clicking on the contact link, or you can send me an email at jenny@crowdcare.org to make a suggestion about future topics. I thought it would be helpful to give ourselves sort of a foundation for all future discussions. So what are clinical trials, and beyond the basics of what they are and how to enroll, how can we use them to our advantage as patients? I fundamentally believe that patients can add to what's being done by great doctors and researchers, and I think we can help drive to a cure faster through knowledge, support, and participation, and maybe a little pushing from the patient side. I don't think we have the luxury of waiting around for a cure to appear, although that would be just terrific. But I don't think it's going to happen that way with the current pace and the current process of how that works. We have amazing people in the field who are all pushing towards the cure, including our guest for today, Dr. Don Benson of the James Cancer Center at The Ohio State University. So hi, Dr. Benson. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Jenny. It's great to be here. Thank you for the opportunity.
Just to give you a little background, Dr. Benson is a myeloma specialist at the James Comprehensive Cancer Center at The Ohio State University. His specialties include multiple myeloma, stem cell transplantation, and a research emphasis in natural killer NK cells and immunotherapy. We're very excited that this will be part of a 2-part series. We will interview Dr. Benson again on August 16th to talk about his latest research in immunotherapy. And after I've spoken with him about what he's working on, I'll tell you that this is a show that you don't want to miss. I'm going to let a patient of his brag about his excellent care on the next interview, but for this interview, I can tell you that Dr. Benson has been a principal investigator or co-principal investigator in over 100 trials, and he was voted 2012 Professor of the Year at the Ohio State University College of Medicine, and he's a world-class researcher as well as a world-class individual. So he is a perfect choice for today's topic. So Dr. Benson, for today's interview, maybe you want to give us some background on clinical trials, why we have them, the purpose, and their design.
Great. Thanks, Jenny. Thanks for the introduction, too. It was very nice of you. I think this is a great topic as a starting point for the series, just to talk a little bit about what a clinical trial is and where this fits in our quest to cure myeloma. Just to start painting with some broad brushstrokes, a clinical trial is a means by which we evaluate potentially new promising treatments for cancer, for multiple myeloma. And I think to understand how this process works, we should step back a little bit and first talk about what people call standard treatments or standard of care therapies. So most people with cancer, most people with multiple myeloma receive standard of care treatments, and that means that these are treatments that in 2013 are the best treatments that we have. And if you step back and say, well, where did these standard treatments come from? How did we get to these treatments? The answer is through clinical trials. That the standards of care that we have today, which candidly are better than last year and better than 5 years ago and certainly better than 10 years ago, these standards came to be because of clinical trials. When we start to make distinctions between decisions about standard treatment, standards of care, versus participating in a clinical trial, one thing that we need to remember is that standard treatments of today were the clinical trials from yesterday. So a clinical trial is a very comprehensive, very complicated research study to evaluate a new treatment for myeloma. They're very tightly regulated. They're very tightly controlled. They have multiple levels of input from ethics boards and regulatory agencies and researchers and scientists, doctors and nurses. Many of these include patients, actually, in their design and their conception and their execution. And clinical trials really are the formal way that we answer questions about new treatments, whether these are going to advance our quest, whether they're tolerable, whether they're safe, and ultimately whether they'll replace our current standards of care.
Okay, that's a great overview. I know that, we talked about this in the last interview, that only 5%, and I think your colleague, I've heard Dr. Craig Hoffmeister say that less than 3% in myeloma patients participate in clinical trials. So do you find that to be the case? And then we asked Dr. Lasky that same question, and he said if we were to have larger percentages of participation, that we could have faster outcomes. So do you agree with that? So
that's absolutely true. So nationally, it's estimated that maybe 5 or 6% of adults who have cancer in the United States participate in a clinical trial of a new therapy at some point in their care. That number is probably a little bit lower for multiple myeloma, and we know that there's other demographic issues and other patient populations where the numbers are even lower than that. One of the best analogies I've ever heard about clinical trial participation is to compare how many adults with cancer participate in trials versus how many children with cancer participate in trials. And the reason that I think it's interesting is if you look at the differences in outcomes between pediatric cancers and adult cancers. So with children, if a child gets cancer, they will have somewhere like a 75 to 80% chance of being treated in a clinical trial, compared to adults, where it's certainly much less than that. It's probably around 5% for adults, right?
Right.
But then the interesting point comes when you compare the incredible progress that's been made in curing pediatric cancers to all the work we have left to do in finding cures for many adult cancers. And so this isn't solely responsible, but it gets home that point that the more people who join clinical trials, the faster the clinical trials can be done, the quicker we get to the answers that we all want.
And do you think that's mostly because I would think as a parent that I would pick my child up and take them to a research facility that was doing probably the most innovative thing that I could find. And I think as adults we might have a tendency to say, well, I have a job and my kids are here, my family's here, so maybe I won't travel if I don't need to. Do you think that's part of the participation issue, or are there other participation issues why you see the big difference?
It's a great question. We could spend an hour talking just about that. I think there's a lot of reasons why that's the case, and I think from a patient's perspective or from a parent's perspective, I think that part of what drives this is just like you said, the altruistic motivation you have for your child to get the best care possible. And in pediatrics, there are very good, dedicated pediatric centers that all work together, that are all doing similar clinical trials. And, our motivation as a mom or a dad is to get that kid to the best place and the best care, and ultimately that, for most kids, is a trial. I think that same altruism that we have as adults gets translated differently, exactly as you said, when one of us gets cancer, that our thoughts, go to how is this going to affect my family, how is this going to affect my job, and how is this going to affect my ability to make ends meet. And so the same intentions may lead to a different conclusion when it's us, as opposed to our children. So I think that's a big part of it. I don't think it explains the whole story, but I think the reaction and the feelings that drive those decisions ultimately end up in a different place when it's us compared to our children.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. I would feel that as a parent also. Okay. Can we step back a little bit and maybe you can give us some kind of background on the different types of trials, because I've heard RO1 trials or SPORE trials, and I don't necessarily understand the difference between the different types of trials there are.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So let's talk about how a drug gets developed, and that'll make sense with what kind of trials there are. So typically the process of developing a treatment for cancer could be 15 years long or more. And when you just say, okay, how long does this take from an idea in somebody's mind in the laboratory to a commercial treatment that becomes a standard of care, I would say that's roughly 15 years. So before a drug ever gets tested in a clinical trial, there could be 5 or 10 or more years of the drug being tested in the laboratory. And so some of this is in vitro work in a petri dish, cell culture work. Some of this is done in animal models, and some of the preclinical testing is with healthy human volunteers too sometimes. But at any rate, most treatments will have up to a decade of research before the drug ever gets into a human being. When a researcher gets to a point where they're ready to test a drug in a patient, they go to the FDA and file some paperwork stating, summarizing their background, summarizing their idea, summarizing the data that they have, and they propose what's called a phase 1 trial. And so this is the first time that the drug's ever going to be given to patients. Generally speaking, we talk about 3 phases of clinical trials. And a phase 1 trial is that first step. So it's the first group of people who are going to get that medicine. Then a phase 2 trial follows that, and then a phase 3 trial comes next. And if everything works out right, then the drug goes up to the FDA to determine whether it can be approved for commercial use as a standard of care type of treatment. Even after that decision's made, there's something called a phase 4 trial, which is a longer study to collect more data to verify what's been found in the earlier work. But let's go through each one. Does that sound good? Through each phase. Okay, so a phase 1 trial. So at this point, a group of researchers and scientists, doctors, have all gotten together, and they've done all of their basic science and all of their translational science, and they really think they've got something very promising, something that's going to advance the care of patients with myeloma. So they get approval from the FDA, and they start their phase 1 trial. The important thing to know, so a phase 1 trial, the first time you're giving it to a patient, I think for me it's helpful to go back to the Hippocratic Oath, that the first thing, the oath we take as physicians, the first thing is to do no harm. And a phase 1 trial, really, you can think about a phase 1 trial as a way to ask that question: is this drug going to do more harm than good? So what happens in a phase 1 trial is the researchers are trying to figure out, is this drug safe? Is it tolerable? Does it have side effects that we weren't predicting? Is it too toxic? The fundamental question in a phase 1 trial is this drug safe? And so this is really...
Does it include dosage too?
Absolutely.
At what dosage is this toxic or not?
Yeah, and that's really the key question in a phase 1 trial is can we give this drug safely? Typically what they do is start with not an infinitesimally low dose, but they start with a very, very low dose of the medicine. And they have statistical methods. They have ways, very rigorous ways, to figure out a good starting dose, and then they'll typically give that dose of the medicine to 3 people. And if they do okay with it, in terms of side effects and safety, then they'll use a larger dose and they'll give that to 3 people. And if everybody does okay with that dose, they'll use an even larger dose on the next 3 people. And so this process will proceed until they give a dose where someone has a side effect, where someone has a significant toxicity. And at that point, they'll go back down to the next lower dose and give the drug to several more people to verify that that's a safe dose. And that's the end of that trial. The phase 1 trial really is just to determine, is this drug safe or not?
And how long does that trial last, typically?
So these trials, phase 1 trials generally are relatively small. They may have at most 20 or 30 patients. Oftentimes they may only have a dozen patients.
Mm-hmm.
And so it may take a year or so, a year, 18 months, to run a trial like that. Now, we'll come back to this in more detail, but certainly in a phase 1 trial, we're looking for any signal that the drug is working, that somebody's M protein is going down, or they're going into remission, or their pain's going away, or that the drug is doing something positive. We're certainly absolutely looking for signs that the drug is working in a phase 1. But really, a phase 1 trial is designed for safety.
Okay.
Takes a year and a half maybe. But the important conclusion of a phase 1 trial is to say, we found a safe dose of this medicine to give to patients with myeloma.
Okay.
Once that's done, once a phase 1 trial is completed, then the drug moves into phase 2. And a phase 2 trial is a little bit bigger. It may have 50, 60 patients. It may have up to 100 patients, I suppose. Depends on the design and so forth. But a phase 2 trial, the big question in a phase 2 trial is, does it work? So we know it's safe, and the phase 2 trial is, does it work? So the primary endpoint of a phase 2 trial can be different depending on the circumstances, but a phase 2 trial is going to look at response rates, or how long a remission lasts, or how far an M protein goes down. It's going to look for some kind of definitive evidence that the drug is working in people.
Okay.
Okay? And a phase 2 trial may take a little bit longer. It's a bigger study, and there's more people involved.
So about how long do you think?
So that's a good question. It depends on what their endpoint is. So if the endpoint is how many people respond to this treatment, it could be 2 years or less, if you're just looking at the percentage of people who respond. If they're looking at how long will your remission last, then the trial could take much longer, right? Because if it's a good drug, and the average length of remission is 3 or 4 or 5 years, it may be an awfully long trial to run.
Right, right.
So you have to be a little bit thoughtful in how you design your endpoints, because if a drug really is providing significant benefit, you want to move it along. You don't want to just keep your trial running for the sake of the statistics. You want to get the drug out into patients who are going to benefit from this treatment. So we can dive deeper into that if you're interested, because it's a really interesting time in myeloma how you define these endpoints, so that you vet the drug, you know what you're dealing with. But on the other hand, if you've got something really promising, you want to get it out, you want to get it forward and make it available. So,
well, sure.
But
so
a phase 2 trial,
how do you do that? Yeah.
In a phase 2 trial, so this is where myeloma is unique, I think. And obviously I'm biased because I take care of people with this disease every day. But myeloma is unique because we have the M protein. So in other words, we have a biomarker, we have a blood test that we can check, and we can know with some confidence right away whether a treatment's working or not, right? Because if the M protein's going down, that means things are getting better. If the M protein's not going down, it means the drug's not doing what we hope it would do.
Mm-hmm.
So many phase 2 trials these days, the primary endpoint is response rate. In other words, how many people are going into remission from this treatment.
And do they look at partial remission or complete remission or both? Or
yeah, so they stratify that. So they'll look at overall response rate, so how many people have any evidence of response, and then they'll divide that up and say, okay, how many people get a complete response, how many people get a partial response, how many people get a minor response. And a lot of trials these days, they'll say, okay, how many people have stable disease, but their pain is better, their anemia is better, their function's better, their quality of life is better. So they'll divide that down into categories after they look at the overall response rate.
Okay.
But that's a really good point, because in myeloma, some of the treatments we have now, the progression-free survival or the length of remission, the duration of response could be very long. And so if you design your trial to look at that, you may have a 6 or 7 year trial on your hands, and that's not fast enough. We need to make decisions and keep moving forward. So because of that, a lot of studies will look at response rate as their primary endpoint. In other words, they'll say, okay, how many people are responding, and based on that number that we'll get in a year, we'll know whether to take this forward or not. But then as a secondary endpoint, they'll go ahead and follow people up long term. Even after enrollment is done and even after the study's completed, they'll continue to follow people and have data on length of remission eventually, but they won't allow that to hold up progress.
Yeah, I don't want progress held up as a patient.
Right.
I'd want to move
especially
it right along to phase
good.
3. Right.
Yeah, especially for something good. I mean, there's a trial, we can talk about examples if you want, but there's a trial that was reported at ASCO where, the median progression-free survival hasn't been reached yet, and it's coming up on 3 years now, and it's like, clearly it's working. Why do we have to wait? But anyway, a phase 2 trial is, does it work?
Okay.
So phase 1 is it safe? Phase 2 is, does it work? And phase 3 is a randomized trial. So this is the first time in the process where randomization happens. And what happens in a phase 3 trial is the most important question. And the question in a phase 3 trial is this. Is this new drug better than the standard of care? So this is the study, the phase 3 study is the trial where half of the people in the clinical trial get the new treatment and half of the people get the standard of care. And then you see if the new treatment is better than the standard of care or not. And it's the ultimate decision, right? It's going head-to-head against the best that we have and saying, is this new treatment really poised to push us forward? Or in the long run, does it turn out to be the same?
And does it always half and half, or can the percentages be split up?
The percentages can be split up. So if you have a particularly promising drug that's really shown a lot of benefit, they may design their trial so that for every person that gets the standard therapy, 2 people get the new one. So it might be a 2-to-1 randomization. The other thing that they do in these studies, so if someone's participating and they get randomized to, say, the standard of care arm, and during the trial they find out that it's looking like the new treatment's better, they have what's called a crossover. So typically what happens in a phase 3 trial is you don't wait 2 or 3 years to find out the result. The data board, the data ethics board, and safety board look at the data every month or every 3 months for any sign that one arm is doing better than the other. And if they see any sign of that, then they do what's called a crossover, and everybody gets the treatment that's working better right away. But the phase 3 trial is really the litmus test for that drug, whether it's going to replace our standard of care or not. And ultimately that decision is up to the FDA, but the phase 3 trial is the one that helps to inform that decision.
And then how many people are in a phase 3 trial, and how long do they take?
So phase 3 trials in multiple myeloma, they're typically hundreds of patients. So the big phase 3 trials that have been done recently have between 500 and 1,000 patients enrolled, and half of the people are getting the standard treatment and half of the people are getting the new treatment. It varies a little bit by how powerful your new treatment is. So if you have a absolutely smashing, sensational new treatment, and you're predicting a big difference between the groups, you may not want to put that many people in your study. Statistically, you don't need that much power to show the difference, and the sooner you get the answer, the better. On the other hand, you can look at trials in breast cancer, for example, where literally 10,000 women might go on a breast cancer trial. In part because the standard treatments are so good that the incremental benefit of new treatments is a little bit less. You need to have that many people to show the difference. But the other reason is breast cancer is more common. Lung cancer is more common, and there's just more people around to be in the trials. But generally in a myeloma phase 3 trial, there's probably between 500 and 1,000 people involved. And the trial itself may take, the recent trials, they take about 3 years or so, something like that.
Okay, so if you add those time frames up, you've got 1 year for the phase 1, and then 2 to 5 years for the phase 2, and then another 3 years for the phase 3, plus your laboratory time. That adds up to the time frame you were talking about. How would it be possible to speed that standard process up? I guess it has to do with enrollment, and if you're having patients enroll and it takes a long time to enroll, that part of it could be sped up. Are there any other spots besides enrollment that could be sped up?
Yeah, great. That's a great question. So one of the easy answers is, if what did we say? 5% of people participate. So say 10% of people participated, you could conceivably cut that time in half, right? If 20% of people participated, gosh, it would really speed the process up. I think those are things, we're trying to do at Ohio State. We have, the last I heard, something like 30% of our patients participate in trials here. So that really helps with the getting to answers faster. I think that what's coming in the future is that our ability to design trials more thoughtfully. And what I mean is that with the science that we have now and with the understanding of myeloma that we have now, we can be more deliberate and more creative in the way that we design new treatments. So that when a drug does come into a phase 1 trial, we could even identify specific patients with myeloma who are most likely to benefit. And conversely, we could identify people for whom that drug may not work as well. And ultimately get to a point where these designer drugs, these targeted therapies, are being run in trials that are designed for patients who are going to most likely benefit from that treatment, and that would speed things up a lot too.
Okay, so let's talk about that for a minute, different approaches to the standard process. I was talking to a researcher, he just finished school, and he said he just made the observation that the current scientific research process hasn't really changed in about 50 years. And I don't know if that's true or not, but it seems like with newer technologies or different approaches, we could really change the way that standard process works. Of course, we want safety, and we want the evaluation process to be run well, but I just think there's got to be a faster way. Now, you had mentioned to me a New York Times article written by someone named Clifton Leaf, who was talking about kind of what you're talking about, the reverse engineering, I guess, of a trial. So instead of taking one drug and then testing it with patients, taking the patients that are with that subtype of myeloma potentially, and then testing multiple even possibly already FDA-approved drugs against that subtype of myeloma. And I thought that was a fascinating approach. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think that that's a great article, by the way, that was in the New York Times a week or so ago. And this is I hope that this is the future of cancer drug development, cancer therapy, and myeloma clinical trials specifically. So I think that the current paradigm that we have, this idea of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, this was developed decades ago when cancer therapies were all very toxic. And so if you think about a drug like melphalan, which is the drug we use for stem cell transplants, or a drug like cyclophosphamide or doxorubicin, conventional chemotherapy drugs, these drugs work indiscriminately. In other words, these drugs kill cells that are dividing. That's how they work. And cancer cells divide, they grow, myeloma cells grow and proliferate, and so they present a target for these drugs, and they work kind of like a poison, right? They impair the cell's ability to grow and divide, and the cells die. And the problem with cytotoxic drugs, with cytotoxic chemotherapy drugs, is any cell that's growing and dividing is going to die as a result. So that's why people lose their hair. That's why people have diarrhea, because your hair is always growing and the lining of your gut is always growing. And so while these drugs are busy killing cancer cells, they're also busy killing any dividing cell. And that's why what they call the therapeutic window, that's why the side effects with conventional chemotherapies are so great. And anyway, from that idea, I think emanated this paradigm of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, that you have to find a safe dose that will be tolerable, and then decide whether that drug works or not, and then decide whether it's better than the standard of care. I think things are changing already. I don't think things are about to change. I think the science has moved past that, and now it's up to the clinical trial process to catch up in the evolution. And the reason for that is we know a whole lot more about cancer than we did 50 years ago, or even 20 years, or even 10 years ago. We know a lot more about the physiology of cancer cells and the metabolism of cancer cells and the genetics of cancer cells. And one of the most important breakthroughs in that process is that we can find targets for treatment. So I when I teach in the medical school, I tell the students that it's kind of like when your computer locks up. It's kind of like when your computer freezes. So you can get a baseball bat and you can hit your computer to try to make it work again, and that's right. That's very cathartic. Yeah, and it's very comforting, and it makes you feel better. But it doesn't fix the computer. And the reason is because when you get a blue screen and your computer crashes and your mouse doesn't work, it's not a problem with the hardware. It's a problem with the software. And cancer, you can think about cancer as being a bug in the software program. That a mutated gene is kind of like having a bug in the software of that cell. And hitting it with a baseball bat is like giving cytotoxic chemotherapy. That, if you can't fix it, just kill it. And in the new era that we've entered, we've clearly entered this era, we can have drugs that work like the Geek Squad. In other words, we have drugs that can go in and find where the problem is in the cell, find where the bug is in the software, and fix it. And you don't lose your hair, and you don't get diarrhea, because the drug only works on the cancer cell that has that bug in the software. So with these new treatments, the treatment everybody talks about is a drug called Gleevec. And so this is a drug for a type of leukemia. So it's not a drug for myeloma, but it helps to illustrate the principle that in CML, in this form of leukemia, there's a very specific mutation that causes the disease. And so before Gleevec, people would get all kinds of chemotherapy that may or may not have worked, and people who were young enough and strong enough would get a donor stem cell transplant, and beyond that, there wasn't much you can do about it. And Gleevec was designed basically to target that mutation that was driving the cancer. So in other words, Gleevec was like the fix for the bug in the software.
So is it in that monoclonal antibody group or no?
No, Gleevec's actually a small molecule.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a small molecule. It's a kinase inhibitor. But the legendary result when Gleevec got their approval from the FDA for their phase 1 trial, and the phase 1 trial of Gleevec, 53 out of the 54 patients got a complete remission.
Wow.
And that was like in 1999.
Stunning.
Many of those people are still doing great today. So, but it illustrates the power of a targeted therapy, that if you really understand the genetics, if you really understand the cancer biology, you don't have to hit it with a baseball bat. You can be very creative in your drug design. And then to answer your original question, you can accelerate the drug discovery process and accelerate the speed towards a cure for the disease.
So where does that change come from? If you were changing the process because you have these more targeted approaches, at what point or step in that stage does it change?
So one way that it's changed recently, not relatively recently, one of the ways that it's changed is through what they call the accelerated approval pathway. So the FDA back, I think, in the 1990s, created a new pathway to development for new treatments for a variety of diseases. It actually came out of all of the research that was being done in HIV and AIDS in the 1990s, where we had this explosion of treatments for HIV. And anyway, what the accelerated approval pathway does is that if a drug has really promising results in a phase 2 trial, and it's clearly meeting an otherwise unmet medical need, so particularly if it's a rare disease or an uncommon condition, the FDA will actually grant approval before the phase 3 trial is done and get the drug out as a standard of care even faster.
And does myeloma fall into that category?
Absolutely, without a doubt. So, in fact, the 2 drugs that have been most recently approved came through the accelerated approval pathway, carfilzomib and pomalidomide. And really, in the last 10 years, the accelerated approval pathway has been dominated by cancer therapies, particularly for uncommon cancers like myeloma, because it represents, relatively speaking, it represents a very important area of unmet medical need. And it's a way to keep pace with the scientific discovery, too, that drugs like Velcade and Revlimid and more recently pomalidomide and Kyprolis, these drugs have gone through accelerated approval to get out to people faster based on phase 2 trial results. They still do the phase 3 studies, they still do the phase 4 studies, but the bottom line is people get good treatments faster this way.
Yeah,
but I think this is only
a better approach.
Go ahead.
No, it's
a
better approach.
I think this is just the beginning. You know, in the end, people get new treatments faster this way. It doesn't obviate the need to ask that question still. You know, is this really better than what we have or not? We need, you need to know that ultimately. But it's at least a way to get good treatments out to people faster.
That's great. Okay, so the different types of trials, going back to that, and then so you helped us understand the phases of the trials. Can you describe what those different types of trials are? And then I have some kind of more general questions about trials. So
describe in more depth each step, you mean?
No, the R01 trials or a SPORE trial. What's the difference between those trials, and do patients need to know about that?
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so let's talk about who pays for trials.
Mm-hmm.
So who pays for all this? There's estimates that it costs anywhere from $800 million to $1 billion to go from an idea in somebody's head to a commercialized standard of care, and that's a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
And it's compounded by the fact that not all drugs that go through phase 1 and phase 2 will make it to phase 3 and make it to the market.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, most drugs don't. Most drugs fail at one step or another. But at any rate, who pays for all this? So one way that these get paid for is through pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies. So they'll develop a drug in their own laboratories or with their own science, and then they'll act as the sponsor for the trials. They'll fund the trials themselves.
Mm-hmm.
There's two ways that happens. One way is that a company designs the trial and then works in collaboration with universities and researchers to run the trial. Or the other way it happens is someone at a university has an idea, or somebody at a cancer center has an idea and goes to the company, and it's called an investigator-initiated trial. But in either way, it's the company that's funding the research. And that's very common. That's not only common in myeloma, but it's common in all types of cancer and really in all types of health conditions, cardiology and diabetes and osteoporosis. And that's a very common way that trials get paid for.
Mm-hmm.
The other way that trials get funded is through the National Cancer Institute. So the way this works is that every year Congress gets together and they decide on a budget, and Health and Human Services gets a budget, and the National Institutes of Health gets a budget, and the National Cancer Institute ends up with a budget. And then the National Cancer Institute has to decide how much money they're going to allocate to research at the NCI and how much money they're going to allocate to cancer research across the country.
Mm-hmm.
And then investigators at mainly at universities and big cancer centers can apply and compete for that money to fund their research. And so in these research programs, you can propose and run clinical trials that are actually paid for by NCI dollars. And there's a couple of ways that can happen. There's different grant mechanisms that you can seek to support clinical research and clinical trials. So traditionally, the grant mechanism that has been really the backbone of cancer research and medical research in general has been called an R01 grant. And an R01 grant is awarded to one person who is an independent investigator in a very specific field who's asking a very specific question. And a typical R01 grant may last between 3 and 5 years. It may be roughly $1 million of funding total, and maybe more than that, maybe a little bit less. But you get the idea. It's a 3 to 5 year grant. It's around $250,000 a year to do your research, and so you can propose to do a clinical trial with that mechanism. Whether or not it's enough money to actually do a trial is debatable, but you could probably do a phase 1 trial that way. You may be able to do a small phase 2 trial that way. But I think that model is going away for a couple of reasons. One reason is that there just isn't a lot of money, that the National Cancer Institute doesn't have a lot of money to fund cancer research, or it depends if you see the glass as half full or half empty, but cancer research funding has absolutely not increased in the last 10 years. If anything, it's stayed the same, or it's gone down if you adjust for inflation.
Yeah, I've read some recent articles about that. That are saying it's pretty level or going down.
Yeah, I think you could say that it's level. But anyway, the fact is that if you apply for an R01, if you're a cancer researcher and you have a great idea and you want to do a trial and you apply for an R01, your chances of getting that award funded today are between 5 and 6%. it's extraordinarily competitive to get an NCI grant these days. Traditionally, 20 years ago, your chances may have been 20 or 30%, and you could resubmit your grant 3 times, you could work on criticisms, you could answer questions, and chances are, if you had a good idea, it would ultimately get funded. These days, that's not the case. These days, you're allowed to resubmit 1 time, and your chances of being funded are between 5 and 6% with that mechanism. So the other general mechanism is to look at collaborative grants. And so there's a couple of mechanisms where researchers can work together and do something even bigger, do something even greater, synergistically by working together on related projects or working together on one project. So one mechanism is called a PO1 grant, or what they call a program project grant. And so this is where a group of researchers come together who have similar complementary interests and ideas, and they propose a programmatic grant where everybody's going to work together towards a common goal. So we have one of these here, for example, at Ohio State. We have one where 5 or 6 of us are together. We're working on immune treatments for blood cancers, and we're all doing our own thing, but the sum of the parts is actually greater than any of the individual parts, if that makes sense. And so in our PO1, I don't know how many trials we have in our PO1. I mean, I have 2 trials in it myself, but there's got to be at least a half a dozen trials in there. It's still a 5-year grant. It's renewable, so we actually got ours renewed, so it's in its 6th or 7th year now, actually. But hundreds of patients have been in clinical trials on that mechanism. We have a really, we can maybe talk about it in the next. It gets into the kind of research we do, but a really cool trial that just closed to accrual with some really neat results. I'm excited to talk about that next time. I'm very
I don't
want to get into
it
yet. But in a program project grant, though, the strength lies in the collaboration. That, okay, let's bring these researchers together. Let's all just acknowledge publicly that one person's not going to cure cancer, that we need to work together. We need to be collaborative. We need to be synergistic. And a program project grant is a way to do that. And then the other big collaborative grant is called a SPORE grant, S-P-O-R-E, and that stands for a Specialized Program in Research Excellence. And that's really a very large grant where a number of literally world-class investigators comes together and says, we're going to create a specialized center where we just focus on this one disease, and we're going to do trials, and we're going to do basic research and translational stuff, and the lab guys are going to talk to the clinic folks and vice versa. And a SPORE grant is really the top-tier grant from the NCI for collaboration in a particular question or a particular cancer. So the pharmaceutical industry pays for trials, the NCI pays for trials, and then the other place where a lot of funding is coming from these days is philanthropy. Groups like the American Cancer Society, groups like Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, these philanthropic groups will, it's the same idea. Investigators have to apply and they have to compete for the money, and there's multiple steps of peer review, and it's a very competitive process. But the philanthropic groups, like Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, for example, have a very clear mission, a very clear agenda. We want to end blood cancers. Who's in? And if you're in, this is a way that you can get funding to do a trial that may not be on the radar of the NCI or may not be on the radar of a drug company. So these days, this is a big source of benefit for the research and ultimately for the patients too. So this is why we have Pelotonia at Ohio State. We have our own fundraiser here that's raised almost $50 million for cancer research, and we have trials here that are paid for by Pelotonia. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I think it's impressive. So, okay, I have a question. If there's limited funding and there's this wide kind of swath of different individuals who want to discover different things or research different things, who is deciding what gets funded and what doesn't? And how does that process work?
Oh, do you have a soapbox I could stand on?
Sure. You got an open mic.
Yeah. So, generally speaking, the who decides is a process of peer review. So, in other words, you come up with your application, you put your best data in there, you put your best ideas, your best support for those ideas, and it's subjected to a peer review process. So at the NCI, for example, there are study review sections where there might be 24 of the best researchers in that particular field who come together 2 or 3 times a year to review all the grants. And they judge the grants on its individual merits, on the science, on the thinking, on the people who are doing it. And then they judge the relative merits and literally say which one is better than the other one. So in the academic realm, in the NCI and at the philanthropic groups, it's a process of peer review of not only which grants hold the most promise, in other words, which trials seem to have the most utilitarian benefit, how many people are going to benefit from this treatment, and how and what degree of benefit are they going to get. But frankly, they're also reviewed on the likelihood of success. In other words, have these people done it before? Can we trust them with taxpayer dollars? Can we trust them with literally with money that was raised from car washes and lemonade stands? You know, we're not to be dramatic, but
no, it is true.
Can we trust them with the money to do what they say they're going to do? And that's a big part of the decision making too. In pharma, in pharmaceutical trials, the decisions are often made internally by the physicians and the scientists who work for that company. 99.9% of the time, though, they're made with input from advisory boards where they'll call up the researchers who do this for a living and say, okay, everybody meet in Chicago because we're going to design a trial together. Or, everybody meet in New York and we're going to sit down and close the door and we're not leaving until we have a trial that's not only promising but also a trial that's going to give us an answer to our question. They have some general similarities. It's get in a room, the best and brightest people we can find and sit down and chart the course, chart the direction together.
Let me ask a follow-up question for some of that, because I know that the outcome of a lot of clinical trials is publishing. And so I think it's a challenge if you're measured on how many papers you're publishing in the industry, and that helps feed into the grants that you're potentially getting, then peer review is a pretty big challenge. Because sometimes, I don't know if I'm outside the industry, so I don't know. But I don't know if all the best ideas are funded or how that all works. Maybe you can speak to that as someone inside the industry.
Yeah, I think so. You're spot on, Jenny. I think that it's helpful for me. I just did a talk with some patients here in our community not long ago, and I told them, pretend like you're in charge of a pharma company, or pretend like you run the NCI. Who would you fund? What projects would you fund? And before you answer, think about what the alternatives are. Okay, so one alternative is you could take some risks. So what I mean by that is if somebody has a completely outside-the-box new idea, new mechanism, new target, new therapy, totally new approach, not a lot of preliminary data, not a lot of publications, not a lot of experience, but the risk-reward of this is so great. I mean, it might be a cure, it might be a long-term, durable remission kind of drug, but there's no track record. There's absolutely no guarantee it's going to work. It's what I would call very high risk, very high reward type of study. the question is, would you fund that, or would you fund the other option, which is a new treatment that is something that's coming out of a line of research, that's a next generation drug of a class we already have. It's something we know something about the safety of this drug class, we know something about the tolerability, we know something about the efficacy, and this new drug is in the same class, but it's going to provide some incremental benefit. So the risk reward is much less. And I tell the students here, it's, if you're playing a baseball game, it would be the difference between a base hit and a home run. And you can't fund both. But what you have to realize is that people who hit home runs oftentimes are people who strike out a lot too. So which one would you fund? You can't fund both. And before you answer, the second question is, who are you going to fund? Are you going to fund a younger investigator who doesn't have a track record, or are you going to fund someone who's been doing it for 30 years, who's gotten results? Where is the money going to go? So, and then you can overlap that with, again, going back to sort of utilitarian ideas. How can I do the most benefit for the greatest number of people? But in my view, those are the kind of decisions people face when they're cutting that pie up and saying, okay, we have limited amount of money, limited amount of resources. Where are we going to invest? And oftentimes the investment goes to the incremental benefit.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a minute, because I would think that you would have a pocket, and I don't know what percentage is, maybe you know the percentage, that invests in the incremental innovation, or we have a hypothesis that this is going to work, and so we're going to fund that, and it's going to be incrementally better, and patients are going to live a few months longer, and that's great. I mean, all innovation's good, right? And then you have this high-risk pocket of people who are saying, well, I'm going to take this already FDA-approved drug and see if it works for myeloma, or I'm going to come up with this very new radical therapy that might work for myeloma. So when you look at the funding, who's doing the funding? Who falls into those different categories?
So I think this is where the philanthropic groups come in. I think that just my opinion, my 2 cents, but the really disruptive therapies, the ones that have the potential to change practice substantially, significantly, those projects are funded from philanthropic groups. Therapies that will provide an incremental benefit. And importantly, I don't want to minimize that. I mean, there are amazing people in pharma. There's amazing people at the NCI. I have nothing but respect for people who dedicate their lives that way. And they have provided us drugs like Revlimid and Velcade, and I mean, that have changed the landscape, right? But the truly, the disruptive therapies, I mean, Gleevec's a perfect example. We talked about it a few minutes ago. The original work with Gleevec was funded by the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. I mean, it was something that, it took a philanthropic group to take a risk like that, just as an example, So that's my general sense of where funding comes from these. But in a lot of ways, it's like building a baseball team, right? You don't want a team of people who hit base hits and no one who can hit a home run. You want kind of a mix of all of that in your team. And I think, from a bird's eye view, when you look at the whole forest, I think that's what we're trying to shoot for, is people who are certainly working on incremental benefits that we can bring to patients quickly. But at the same time, you want a core group of people who are willing to think outside the box and really think fundamentally different than the rest. And ultimately, they're the ones who are going to propose, the innovative kind of things that may lead to very sudden changes in treatment. So part of the problem is this, that part of the problem is that we know what we know, but we don't know what we don't know. And so if you ever, or if your listeners, if anybody ever hears someone stand up, a politician or a researcher, or if you hear someone stand up and say, "Well, we're going to have a cure in 2016," and that's dishonest. That's disingenuous.
Mm-hmm.
We don't, I can tell you honestly, I can tell you that we're further along today than yesterday. I can tell you we're a lot further along than we were 5 or 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't tell you where we'll be tomorrow until we get there. I think that ultimately, I don't mean to keep flipping into analogies, but I think ultimately it's like running a marathon without a map. You
Mm-hmm.
kind of know it's 26.2 miles, and we know what the finish line looks like. We want to cure myeloma. None of that's in doubt. But what's in doubt is, do you turn left or right at the next intersection? Or is there a hill coming up? Or, did we go down a wrong street here? And really the only thing you can control is whether you're going to run or not.
Mm-hmm.
You can either decide to run or you can decide to give up. And beyond that, the only thing you can control is how fast you run, and that has to do with the funding. And then the other thing you can control is how many people are in the race, and that's how many people participate in clinical trials. And those are the variables that will get you to the finish line faster.
I agree. And I think there might be one more variable that I don't know if it's used in medicine or how it's used in medicine, but my husband's an investor, and so we've been on the end, and an entrepreneur. So in the environment that he's in, they might have an 80% failure rate in startups. It's kind of the general number. And what he's trying to do is how do we focus down and eliminate most of the risks so we can fail early and fail fast.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it is in having the accountability. So in science, I notice that sometimes when we've done maybe angel investing or just kind of philanthropic investing, and then there's no accountability on the other side, there's a high predictability that money will not be used wisely. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to trials, how does the accountability piece work? Either this study was successful, and I'm going to shut down maybe a phase 2, or just the whole process. Who's accountable and to whom?
So good question. So one of the new phase 2 trial designs is called it's called a go no go design. And so what this trial design does statistically is that it attempts to answer the efficacy question very early in the treatment. And so typically what they'll do is they'll write their trial design to enroll between 9 and 12 patients. And if they don't see X number of responses in that early cohort, they shut the trial down. Mm-hmm. And they don't continue. And then they take that money somewhere else. If they do a trial and they enroll 9 to 12 patients and half of the patients respond, then they expand it to 40 and they go on. So it's called a two-stage design or a go-no-go trial. So you're leveraging this really important decision based on your first experience in the first group of people. So that's helped to weed out the treatments that aren't that promising right away. Mm-hmm. For me, though, the question, it just comes back again and again for me is well, why did these people respond and these people didn't? Couldn't we have predicted something by their disease biology or by their the person's metabolism or by their immune system or by the nature of their disease? Why couldn't we have predicted this a priori? Mm-hmm. In other words, why couldn't we have written this study to maximize our response rate out of the gates rather than have to rely on a go-no-go design where, you just gave the drug to 5 or 6 people and they didn't benefit from it. Because I think we're smarter than that now. We're at a point where we can design trials better in terms of eligibility and circumvent this whole problem. But going back to accountability, so, I guess I don't know that I can speak to pharma accountability. They have the same regulatory accountability that we do, both on an ethics side and on a legal and regulatory side for reporting and following patients and ensuring welfare and so forth. We haven't really talked at all about that, how patients are protected in trials. That's huge. But with NCI grants and there's multiple steps of accountability though with philanthropic dollars and NCI grants. But anyway, the same thing holds true with patient welfare, that there's multiple levels of protections built in for patients on trials that deal with foundational concepts about autonomy and beneficence and acting in a fiduciary manner, in a responsible manner for the patient. And that's all built in with the review boards and the ethics boards and the data safety monitoring boards, and trials are audited routinely by the FDA, by the sponsor, by the IRB, by internal audits. So from a patient welfare standpoint, that's all taken care of to every degree possible. So
I think that the reasons a patient may not want to participate or haven't participated so far. The American Cancer Society listed 4 reasons, and one was just lack of awareness, that they didn't know the trial was happening. So I think that might be on the clinician side, to educate their patients about what trials they're running and the potentials.
Yeah, that's entirely in our lap. That's nothing to do with patients. If a patient is not aware of a trial, that's entirely our fault as their caregivers, as their care providers. Part of the challenge, part of the problem with clinical trials is they take a lot of time. That if someone's in a busy practice and they only have 15 minutes to spend with a patient, there may not be time to talk about a trial. When at my clinic, all I do is take care of people with myeloma. So, we're busy, and it's we're always behind. Part of that is because we think this is important. That if it takes a half hour or 45 minutes to talk about a trial and what it is and what it's like and whether it's right for you or not, then it's worth that time investment. It's a really important thing. So I think this idea that patients aren't aware, that's all on us. That's all on the physicians.
Well, I know just for me, it would have been fine for me had somebody talk to me at the clinic about it, not necessarily my myeloma specialist, because maybe I can ask follow-up questions for him. But if somebody says, this is the trial we're running as my physician's assistant or something, and I just want to let you know about it, give you a little more information about it, this is what it's supposed to do, and kind of do the preparatory work, I think that's an easy thing to do, because you're spending plenty of time in the clinic. let me say that there's enough wait time to review something like that when you're in the clinic.
Yeah, I agree. We're really lucky here with the nurse practitioners we have, and the whole team, even the clinic nurses and the PCAs, and everybody's on board with this too, that trials are important. So but I think you're right, that the lack of awareness then, if it's not something that's brought up early on in somebody's care, then it kind of fosters sort of a suspicion, or not suspicion, but kind of, well, why are you talking about it now? Why didn't we talk about this 2 years ago if they're so important, kind of thing. And I think there's a lot of mystery around it, and you always hear, I didn't want mom to be a guinea pig, so I told her not to do the trial. And, well, what does that mean? What does that really mean? I can tell you I've been, going back to 1992 and getting 2 doctoral degrees, I've never experimented on a guinea pig, ever. I don't know where that analogy even came from.
Well, you talked about that at the beginning of our conversation, where you were saying it's either the standard of care or something better. So I think at least in myeloma, that you don't really need to worry about that as a patient, is feeling like that, because you're either going to get the standard of care, which is not a cure at this point. So we do need to do something differently if we're going to move things forward. So
yeah, I totally agree. that's a concern too, that people say, well, if I go in this trial, I might get a placebo. Well, let's talk about that for a minute. So,
sure.
I think part of that is a big part of that is on us too, as the physicians, that we're not explaining trials properly, and we're not explaining, what happens in a trial. That now we do trials that have placebos. In fact, we recently, Ohio State led the accrual on the biggest trial in North America for post-transplant maintenance. So this was a study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine a couple years back that showed if you take Revlimid after a transplant, it makes your remission last longer. And half of the people in that study got a placebo, and half of them got Revlimid. So why could we do that? Why is that ethical? Well, the reason is because at the time, the standard of care was do nothing. The standard of care was observation. But if you observe half the people and the other half the people got a pill, then everyone would know who was on Revlimid and who wasn't. So the people who got the standard of care, which was observation, took a placebo, and that way nobody knew who was on Revlimid and who was on placebo. So in a trial like that, now that's really rare, but it's an example of when we would use a placebo, and the only time we would do that is if the standard of care was do nothing. And there aren't many times in myeloma where the standard of care is do nothing. So, in most trials, the standard of care is the best we got. And in fact, there are some phase 3 trials where the new drug is randomized against investigator's choice, which I think is a great trial design. So in other words, you have your drug, your very promising drug, and you randomize it against whatever the doctor wants to give that patient. You think you got something better? Then give it. That's a trial design, because then you say, okay, is this better than everything everyone else has ever come up with? And I'd like to see more phase 3 trials done that way, actually.
Yeah, it sounds. I think there is a need to explore new opportunities in how the trials are structured, or how we choose them, or can we work backwards, like you were saying, and do things more specifically. I think part of it is too changing the perception of risk in the medical field, because I used the example earlier of entrepreneurship. Well, it's perfectly acceptable for 80% of startups to fail. We kind of assume that there's these are new ideas, they're radical ideas, they may or may not work. We're trying to narrow it down. My husband's trying to narrow it down to a process, so it's not so much risk taking. But the perception that this is crazy, I think medical professionals end up taking a reputation hit when you could beat up the idea and not the individual in innovation when it comes to medical innovation. And sometimes these visionaries will see this and start working on a protocol, and everyone else will say, they're crazy. And then 10 years after all the data is out, okay, they weren't so crazy.
Maybe they weren't crazy, yeah.
I don't know how to change that perception. Maybe you can take a subset of the innovation and drive it through a different structure, so you kind of de-risk it as much as possible. But I think there is a lot of reservation that comes with people who are incredibly smart, and they're in the field, and they have all the puzzle pieces that they can put together, and they're in this trap, sort of in this environment sometimes that is not really, it's very risk averse.
So I think two things with that. I think one is that we're really lucky at my institution because we have dedicated chemotherapy pharmacists who will counsel patients, and we have our nurse practitioners, and we have this team philosophy, and we really try to engage folks as partners in their disease. We want people to learn. We want people to be involved and really help, make decisions and figure out what's best for you, because what's best for you might not be what's best for the person in the next room. But having said all that, I think the attraction of standard therapy is that it's standard therapy. So it must be less risky, it must be less toxic, it must be safer, and that's not always true. I think that a lot of us kind of take for granted that because it's a standard, it's safe, and then we kind of gloss over, well, there is a risk of blood clots, there is a risk of infection, there is a risk of neuropathy, and I think, if you read the informed consent for a trial, there's 5 pages of, risks in there. Oftentimes people don't get an informed consent for standard treatment, and they're not fully aware of all the risks of a standard treatment. So it's not apples and oranges. Standard treatments are, can have dangers, and so I think that's part of the problem is that maybe doctors just don't want to talk to patients about the possible bad side effects that inevitably come up in a clinical trial discussion. You have to disclose everything in a trial, where it might just be easier and quicker to do a standard treatment and not have to worry about, full disclosure maybe. And then you kind of alluded to this earlier, the publication bias, that this idea that if a trial doesn't succeed, it's not going to get published, and, people's careers are on the line and their reputations are on the line and so forth. Well, I've published, I don't know how many negative trials, but what we do with each one is say, okay, well, why didn't this work the way we thought? Why didn't it work like it did in the mice, and why didn't it work like it did in the test tube? And we still learn from that. We did a study a few years ago that we gave a treatment and it worked, but it didn't work as well as we wanted. And we went back and said, well, why? Why didn't this work? And it turned out that all these patients that we had enrolled on the study had a mutation in their immune system that wouldn't bind the drug. And we didn't even know it existed. We didn't even know. How would you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
But it wasn't until we said, well, dang it, how come it didn't? And went back and did those correlates, and it got published in a good journal, but that's not the point. The point is we learned something to help us take care of the next patient. And so even a negative trial can be beneficial. And we talked about this before the phone call started, that there are even studies that have been done and research that has been done that people may actually be more likely to benefit in a trial than if they get standard treatment, actually. And whether it's because they're getting a new and better treatment, or whether it's because they're getting better care, is debatable. But for sure, in a trial, you're going to have more people looking at your numbers, more people assessing your quality of life, more people looking at your blood tests, more people looking at your total picture, because it's in a trial, because there's a data safety monitoring board, because there's an ethics board, because there's a research nurse, because there's a statistician, because there's a dedicated pharmacist, because there's someone who's going to call on Wednesday morning and just check in and see how you're doing. And you have all these people behind you in the trial that you don't have with standard therapy. So.
Okay, well, I guess my last question, then I'm going to open it up for caller questions, is how can patients best help speed up the discovery process for a cure through clinical trial participation?
So I think the best answer is get involved and ask questions, and be a partner in your care. Take the reins and take charge. I tell all my patients this myself. We're a tertiary referral center, and I've told many of my patients, hey, you know what? Get a second opinion. It's take a week or two and get a second opinion. There's nothing wrong with that. I think taking charge and getting involved is number one. And then step two is learn about trials. Find out what's out there. There's all kinds of resources online. There's all kinds of resources from the various philanthropic groups. And then talk to, when you're talking with your doctor, talk about trials. And if they propose a trial for you, ask why. Why is this trial good for me? Why is this trial good right now for me? And then my favorite question, a patient of mine asked me this once, and it was such a wonderful question. And I would say, how are the results of this trial going to change your practice? That's a great question to ask, to really dive deep in. It is a great question. Because not all trials are created equal. We talked about this before too, that trials are evaluating different drugs and different approaches and different therapies and different options. And I think a great question to ask is, hey, you know what? I'm really interested in being in this trial. Just one question for you. How is this going to change your management? How is this going to change your care? I think that's a phenomenal question to ask. And if you get a good answer, I would think about being in it.
Mhm. It's a great suggestion, and it's a great question. It really is. Okay, I would like to open it up for questions about clinical trials. So if any of our callers have questions, you can press 1 on your keypad that are listening. And then if you do have a question, you can turn off the sound on your computer so we don't get the feedback. Okay, I have one caller's question. Okay, go ahead with your question. Are you there? Oh, sorry. Okay, I have a caller open for a question.
Can you hear me right now?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay. Dr. Benson, first I just want to thank you for your time today. It's been really good. I have a question regarding your processes and the resources that you have to you. What if you could wave a magic wand and take down one hurdle in your work? What would it be? What would kind of make you be able to do your work faster and get to a cure more quickly?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. Thank you. If I could take down one barrier, I tell you, so I would not take down the regulatory barriers. I think that the process of starting up a trial, it could take you easily 6 months to open a trial because of all the regulatory reviews and review boards and ethics boards and so forth, and I wouldn't change any of that. I think that kind of rigor is crucial. Mm-hmm. I think that one barrier is being addressed now, certainly in our state in Ohio, and I know there's probably 25 or 30 states that have adopted this, but there had been a financial barrier to trial participation in that a lot of insurance companies would not cover clinical trial participation for patients. Mm-hmm. And now many states have adopted laws to prevent that. And so this legislation basically says that if somebody has cancer and they want to be in a clinical trial, the insurance companies must let them participate. And the rationale is that anything that's considered to be investigational is covered by the sponsor. All that's asked in these laws is that the insurance companies pay for the standards of care that patients would get anyway. Mm-hmm. That was a huge, I can't tell you how huge that was when that barrier fell, because a lot of patients who wanted to be in a trial, who wanted to make a difference for themselves and for the next patient in the waiting room, couldn't do it because their insurance company wouldn't allow it. And so we're breaking that barrier down now nationally. I think that in addition to having more people participate, I think we're making a little bit of progress in that. I think we're making a little bit of progress in designing more rational trials as well in terms of mm-hmm. matching patients with treatments that are most likely to work. I think the only other thing I would do is potentially shift more funding into the really paradigm-shifting types of approaches. So, mm-hmm. in other words, I think
more big swings.
Yeah, I'm in agreement. I think that these treatments that come out that provide an incremental benefit, that's a great backbone. I think it's a great place to focus resources. But I think that not only in myeloma but in cancer and in medicine in general, when you look at the therapies that have changed practice, the therapies that have cured diseases, they kind of came out of the blue. It's not like they were scheduled or they were predictable. It was people who were answering really hard questions, who were spending their lives on one really fundamentally difficult question, And how they got there was just hard work. How they got there was doing the experiments and trying and failing and going back to it and trying again. And it can be a little demoralizing, right? Because you could go months or you could go years without that breakthrough. But when it happens, everything changes overnight from then on. I mean, Gleevec's the perfect example. And there's others, too, we could talk about. But it's hard for, if I was an investor and I had money to invest, would I want to take that risk? And I don't know. I think it makes it hard, but
I think I also have a little bit of investment experience like Jenny's husband, and I think you need to get a lot of those swings at one time so you can show some success, because one big swing is likely going to fail. So just from a pure political standpoint of getting the support you need, trying to do more than one at a time could be helpful, I think. So
I do too. I think for whatever reason, I think those kind of ideas are the first ones to suffer when you're in an environment of limited means and limited resources. You want to be utilitarian, and so that means ultimately looking at incremental benefit. And that's great. I'm not trying to downplay that at all. But I think it's not great to sacrifice funding that goes into these really transformative ideas where 99 out of 100 of them might not pan out, but the one that does is going to change things literally overnight. And I think we can't forget about that.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, thank you for your work on this, Dr. Benson. I really appreciate you taking my question.
Absolutely. Thanks for listening. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, second question. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, hi, Dr. Benson. This is Paul. First of all, I want to thank you for a very thorough coverage of the subject matter. You started eating up all my questions as I was listening in. So I'd like to follow up on the last caller, as they're talking about funding the disruptions versus the incremental. And you mentioned that you're looking at the whole forest, and sometimes it's hard to get lost at that perspective. But taking the forest analogy, if you don't plant the seeds, you're not going to get the trees. And as a spouse, as a caregiver, it's frustrating to listen as you're talking about where most of the investment is going into this incremental innovation, these incremental cures. Or it's actually not moving towards a cure, it's just incremental, but it's not driving a cure. And there's very limited dollars, as I've understood, focused on this, things that are driving cures, this disruptive area. So as patients and caregivers, what can we do to change that paradigm? And I acknowledge that some of these, I think we can donate to organizations that are driving. But is there something else we could do that's even more radical? Maybe that's not a fair question for you. So, Jenny, maybe you could help answer this. But is there something we could do that's more radical to just drive dollars to areas that have a higher probability of failure, but if that works, it could generate the cure? And in the funding continuum, you want to do later stage investments and safer stuff, but if you don't plant the seeds, you don't get the trees, and so you have to be able to put some money at the early stage and take that risk. But the people that are willing to take the risk are people like us that are like there are no cures out there, so we're willing to make those investments. But I don't see the mechanisms out there to do that, or maybe I'm just missing it. What else is out there that we could invest into today to help drive that, to help get these younger doctors that are thinking a little bit differently into the research mix?
Yeah, so you hit it on the head. I don't know if I could have said things better myself. I think that what can you do? You can write to your representatives. You can write to your governmental representatives with these kind of ideas. You can write to the NCI. You can get involved in, these are just kind of low-hanging. You can get involved in your local Leukemia and Lymphoma Society chapter, American Cancer Society chapter. Those are all things that you can do. I think the program we have here at Ohio State, Pelotonia, is it's a cycling event that happens once a year, and the vast majority of that money actually goes into these kind of seed grants. It's literally like $100,000 grant. It's 2 years of protected time, but the caveat is it's for a transformative idea. In other words, it's risk capital, right? It's money that's going to be invested into something that's completely out of the box, has no preliminary data at all, but it gives the scientists here 2 years and $100,000 to really ask the first questions of whether this is something that should be pursued or not. I know other cancer centers are starting the same idea. Dana-Farber has PanMass Challenge. I know the Hutch out in Seattle is starting a similar program, but this idea to preferentially fund really transformative thinking and with the full realization that the failure rate for these is going to be very high. But I'm reminded of a study. So this was published, I think, in BMJ, in the British Medical Journal, probably 10 years ago now. But it was a really interesting study, and it's kind of hard to express, but bear with me. What these researchers did, they were actually social scientists, and they went out in the streets of London, and they posed this question to folks out in the public. They said, imagine for a minute that you had an incurable cancer. There was no treatment options left, and you were really in dire straits, and you had two treatment options. The doctors said that the one thing we could do is we could give you supportive care and pain medicines and keep you from suffering. And if we choose that route, there's a 90% chance that you won't have any suffering, but you probably won't live more than 3 to 6 months. And the other option is we could admit you to the hospital and we could do this experimental treatment, and the chances of having side effects and toxicities and significant problems with this treatment are very high. They're like 70 or 80% chance you'll have really significant problems, and that, in fact, you might actually die from this treatment. And so the question was, what would the chances of success have to be for you to pick that treatment over supportive care? And so, does that make sense? So when
that makes perfect sense.
Okay, so when the researchers went out into the general population and asked this question, most of the people answered that the chances of success would have to be very high for that treatment to work for them to pick it. And so I don't remember what it was, but it was like 75%, that it had to be a 75% chance of the treatment working for them to pick that over supportive care. So the researchers thanked them, and then they went to oncology nurses, and they asked them the same question. And the oncology nurses said, something, the chances of that treatment working had to be, something similar, or maybe it was even higher, as I remember. It might have been like 80% chance of it working for them to pick it. And so then they asked a group of oncologists, and their answer was the same. It was, 60 or 70% chance of it working. So then the researchers did something very interesting. They actually went to patients who were in that boat. So they sought out patients who had terminal cancers who had progressed to a point where they had no standard treatment options left, and they posed them that question. And so they asked these people, what are the chances of this treatment working? What would the chances have to be for you to accept that treatment? And you know what the patient's answer was? 1%.
Oh, really? Wow.
It was 1%. And I think that study, I make our medical students here read that study because it's so illustrative of what people are dealing with in real life, that we can sit here and talk for hours about how trials are done and the statistics and the funding and but I think that when I read that study, it really hit home. My dad had cancer, and he was in a clinical trial, and but I digress. But my point is that I think that as a community, we need to be more in tune with where our patients are on a daily basis and what they're facing and what their families and their loved ones are going through. And like you said, what are the implications of that with how we allocate our funding and our resources?
Mm-hmm. Okay, excellent. I'm going to add another question. Okay, we have another caller.
Hi, yes. My name is David. I'm a student at the University of Utah. I just had a quick question. I have a friend who has cancer, and I was just wondering how best I can help them get into their desired trial, if there was anything I could do for them in that regard.
That's great, Dan. Thanks for listening and thanks for calling. I think that I'll rather than answer you as a doctor, I'm going to answer you as a friend of a patient too. One of my best friends has cancer right now, and she's being treated here. She doesn't have myeloma; she has breast cancer actually, and is going through pretty aggressive treatment right now. And I think that as a friend, the first thing that I would say is be available. I think that having seen this from both sides, a lot of people get a lot of support. They get a lot of rally around when the diagnosis comes. And then what happens over time is everybody gets back kind of in their routine, and everybody has their own obligations and their own commitments that they have to keep every day. And so once the dust dies down, the friends they don't go away, but they kind of go back to their lives again. And so I think number one, I would say just be available. Just be. You don't have to take flowers, and you don't have to, but just be available. Just it could be just call and say hi kind of thing. Just put it on your calendar to be available. I think if you have that kind of relationship with your friend, I don't know what your relationship's like, but if you're tight enough to talk about how treatments are going and what they're feeling, how they're dealing with things, then maybe you can take the next step and say, well, why are you on that treatment? Do you want me to go to a doctor's visit? And did you ask your doctor what your other options are? Did your doctor mention anything about trials? I think those are questions. They're hard. I think it depends on the relationship and how tight you are with them. But I think the best piece of advice, and Jenny, you could weigh in too, obviously, but I think the best piece of advice is just be available. Just carve it out in your week and be available.
Well, if you have a relationship, then you can help with other things. But, we had a family member who had AML and very severe form of leukemia. And so we've been through this process multiple times. And it is helpful when you're in that panic state to have somebody else do a lot of the homework for you. And it's very, very helpful for people to get online and research, because sometimes when you're taking the drugs and you're in a stressful situation, it's not the time to start researching drug modalities. And it's overwhelming, and so you kind of shut it out. But if somebody can do some of that homework for you and say, I found these 3 things you might want to look at, I think that's really helpful. Okay, we have one more question. Okay, go ahead with your question.
Hello?
Uh-huh.
Hi, my name is Kibet Martin, and I have some friends with cancer, also a lot of family in the medical industry. My mom's a nurse, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the issues in the clinical recruitment process. It seems like a lot of patients are having large issues with the complexities in clinical trials. And I know right now a lot of the trends are moving towards innovation and collaboration. Specifically, I know of an organization that wants to change the way clinical trials recruit candidates by giving patients access to data. And I just wanted to know what your views are, Dr. Benson, on more patient-centered approach to these clinical trials and how these can help the innovation and collaboration process.
That's a great question. Thank you for bringing that up. I think that I would go back kind of to the first principle that we mentioned earlier, that I think the doctor and the patient have to have a partnership. They have to have a very honest relationship and a very interactive relationship. And that takes time to develop. I think you don't just trust somebody when you meet them the first time. You really have to develop a relationship with them. You have to know who their spouse is and know what fulfills them in life, what's important to them, and something that takes time. But I think that's the kind of relationship that somebody with myeloma needs with their doctor. And so they can have conversations not only about trials but about everything in life, you know. I think when it comes to trials, I think that the same kind of standards hold, that the more you know, the better. And for a patient to be in a trial, you know, the folks who I take care of here who are on trials, we talk about everything. You know, we talk about what's going on in the other treatment arms. We talk about toxicities other patients have had. We've talked about, you know, here's the last 6 patients that have gone on this. You know, I don't tell them their names and where they live, but we talk in general about how they're doing and if their diseases are similar or different. And, you know, personally, I have no problem sharing that with my patients. I think programmatically, if you're talking about what can we do as a system to improve things, I think these kind of data sharing ideas are great. You know, a lot of my patients, so Ohio State, let me back up. Ohio State has a big reputation in experimental therapeutics and in phase 1 trials. So a lot of patients who come here, you know, specifically because somebody somewhere else told them that there's nothing left. And so we have a lot of patients who come to be in a phase 1 trial here, and many of them come not for themselves, but because they want to help the next person, or because of some very, very incredible altruistic drive to make life better for everybody else. And these people want to know the results of the trial, you know, and so we share that at every extent. But what else can you do? You can look at the journals and see what's being published. You can go to I mean, it's kind of hard to go to a meeting, but you can get the synopses from the cancer research meetings and find out right up to date how many people are responding, what kind of toxicities are being seen, what kind of subtypes seem to be benefiting the most. I absolutely encourage that. I think that that's part of the fulfillment that a patient gets from being in a trial, is knowing that you made a difference, that, you know, the next person and the next family that has to deal with this is going to be in a better place because of your decision.
I agree. Well, thank you, Dr. Benson, for joining us today. We've kept you a while, but it was great information, and I'm glad we covered it. We are very excited to hear from you again on the 16th and look forward to listening or learning more about your research in immunotherapies. If you would like to contact Dr. Benson directly, you can look at our doctor directory. He's listed in our doctor directory, and at the bottom of his listing, you'll see a place where you can say send a message, and that will send an email directly to him at his facility. So thank you again so much for participating with us, and we look forward to the coming weeks.
It's a great privilege, Jenny. Thank you for inviting me on, and look forward to our next one. It'll be fun.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, thanks for listening to another episode of Innovation in Myeloma. Join us next week for another M-Patient radio interview that helps connect myeloma patients with researchers to drive better outcomes for us all.
Okay, round 2. Name something that's not boring.
A laundry? Ooh, a book club. Computer solitaire, huh?
Ah, sorry, we were looking for Chumba Casino. That's right, ChumbaCasino.com has over 100 casino-style games. Join today and play for free for your chance to redeem some serious prizes. ChumbaCasino.com. No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18+ terms and conditions apply. See website for details.